Welcome to Bio 201. I'm Professor Kramer. At some point, I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to meet and do some open Q&A, open discussions, one-on-one meetings. But for now, let's get us started. Please make sure that you have familiarized yourself with Canvas, with our syllabus, and the lab and lecture schedules. Everything is online, but you'll notice that there's a lot going on. So I have organized ours by modules. You should be able to follow along with the semester through the modules. Each module matches up with a week. So module 1 begins with August 24th, course introduction and chapter 1. And also listed with module 1 will be any lab components for this week. So for this particular week, I'll also potentially set up a second recording to introduce you to the lab and talk to you a little bit about tissues and share with you some more about that. There are some things already posted. But remember to make sure that you familiarize yourself with all the aspects of Canvas and the syllabus and the 2 lab and lecture schedules. There's also on the discussion board a place for an open question and answer. Post anything that is general course related, and then make sure that you email me with any personal or, kind of just for you types of questions that you might have. So we begin our semester with just a brief overview and some basics, just an orientation. In the course, we cover the first part of human anatomy and physiology, essentially chapters 1 through 14. But I don't cover chapter 7. So we're talking about orientation, chemistry, cells, tissues, integument, skeletal, joints, muscular, and nervous systems. There'll be 4 lecture exams, 3 lab exams, numerous amounts of quizzes, and then some weekly work that you are also responsible for. And this first week, it's just a syllabus receipt that you are responsible for completing. So here we go, chapter 1, the human body, just an orientation. So we begin our orientation with a couple of definitions, and it's important to understand that we are talking about both parts of this throughout our entire semester together. So anatomy is defined as the science of the structure and shape of the human body and the relationship between those body parts. So we're going to learn by observation, and it comes from the Greek word to cut up. So here's your definition of anatomy. And then we take a look at the rest of the definition of this entire semester, and it is the science of body work or function, right? So the study of the physical and chemical processes that direct our actual activity. So here we learn by experimentation, and this comes from the Greek study of nature. So the question here is, can you have one, or the study of one, is one more important than the other? Let's think about that for a second. So as you're thinking about whether or not one is more important than the other, anatomy versus physiology, I'm going to just tell you that we have 2 approaches to the study of gross anatomy and physiology. The first is our systemic, or the study of all organs of a system together. It's essentially a system-by-system approach, i.e. we're studying the circulatory system, so we'd be studying the heart and blood vessels. Right? We're studying the integumentary system, so we're studying the skin. Right? And this is going to be kind of the approach that we take in this course. But we are going to talk about what's going on in different areas of the body and how they interact. And then we have our regional approach, which is study of all of the organisms or structures in one area. So in a regional approach, we would take an arm and study everything that's going on with the arm. So that is not necessarily the approach we're going to take, but it is an approach. So what did you decide? Did you decide that you could do anatomy without physiology? Well, unfortunately, because of the complementarity of structure and function, we really can't have one without the other. And so as we start to look at organizational levels and we take a brief look at the organ system, we're going to be thinking about both the structure and the function. These are going to be complementary. So as we head in here to these organizational levels, these are going to work from simple to complex. So we start at the chemical level. We have atoms which form molecules, like water, which form macromolecules, known as large molecules, and there are 4 of those, that form organelles, which are the basic components of cells. Right? So your atom is your building block matter, and our 4 macromolecules, carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. So we start at that chemical level. And then we go to the cellular level. So these are cells, which are the most basic functional unit in the body. All cells are going to share some common functions, but individual cells vary in size and shape and therefore reflect unique functions. And so the cells and their functional subunits, we'll see more of that in chapter 3. At the tissue level, we take a group of cells working together to perform a common function, and we see 4 of those types in the body. You'll learn more of those right away in lab this week: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. So those are our 4 common. When we take a group of tissues, 2 or more tissue types, working together to perform a specific function, we get an organ. Okay? 4 is the most common number of tissues, and you think of each individual organ as a special functional center for that specific activity that only it can perform. Okay, so the tissues that work together are going to become a functional unit carrying out one specific function that only they can do. When you take other organs with similar or related functions and you put them together, we get an organ system: respiratory, digestive, circulatory, etc. And when we take all of those systems together into one living structure working together to keep the organism alive, you get to the organism level. And all of your cells, all of this is interdependent. So this is just one example of that organizational level. You can see it starts with the chemical level. And atoms are combining to form molecules, and those molecules are going to form, in this particular example at the cellular level, a smooth muscle cell. So if you get a bunch of smooth muscle cells together, they form a smooth muscle tissue. You get different types of tissue. You see epithelial tissue inside of smooth, inside of connected. We'll learn more about how that works together later, but that's an organ. And when you take a look at a bunch of organs together, which in this case is the heart and the blood vessels, talking about circulation, and the circulation is going to work with a bunch of systems to create one functional human. So as we move along quickly here, we're going to get into just the very basics of the organ system. I'm not going to spend a lot of time telling you anything that's not already pre-printed on these slides, but maybe just a couple other items that maybe aren't listed. Just remember the basics of the integumentary system is it's essentially our first line of defense. It's going to do an awful lot for us. External support, body covering, and protection, all sorts of stuff, waterproofing, cushioning, etc. In the skeletal system, we're talking about our internal framework for movement, working in conjunction with our muscular system, and blood cell production performed within the bone. We have storage for minerals, and again, it's generally our framework for how a lot of our movements can be performed, and we'll talk about that more when we talk about both skeletal and muscular systems. And here, in relationship with the skeletal system, we actually can manipulate the environment. So we're talking about the production of movement, all sorts of kinds of movement, including our actual locomotion, but then also some small fine uses. So this is our final system we cover in Phys 1, so Bio 201. I will give you the brief overview of the others, but the nervous system, you're talking about brain, spinal cord, nerves, sensory receptors. This is your fast-acting system, so it's going to respond to changes going on both inside and outside of the body. And we're going to spend, I hope, a bit of time on that and get to look at some fun things. We'll see how the semester progresses. So here we're talking about the basic premise behind the obtaining of oxygen and the removal of carbon dioxide and how that process works in the human body to keep the blood rich and functioning, delivering hemoglobin and a bit of business. So really the biggest part of this is about gas exchange from the lungs. So our circulatory or cardiovascular system, focusing on the heart and the blood vessels, this is our body's, quote, pump, right? So the oxygen and carbon dioxide kind of passing in and out with the help of the respiratory system has to be moved through the body, and this pump is going to do that, including carrying nutrients and waste. With the lymphatic system, we're talking about body immunity and the pickup of lost leaking fluids, so disposing of debris, attacking foreign substances, dealing with white blood cells, mounting attacks against foreign substances. And in 202, I hope you'll take a look at how some viruses create a misleading situation in which the body uses its own immune system against itself, but that's a 202. So oftentimes this system is taught kind of side by side with the nervous system, where your nervous system is your fast-acting system, endocrine is your slow control, working with glands that secrete hormones to regulate. So you'll see a little bit of our biofeedback mechanisms in this system, kind of like how a thermostat turns off and on. And we'll actually talk about homeostasis in a little bit, so I don't want to give too much away. So the human filtration system, this is going to regulate water, electrolyte, and acid-base balances by filtering our blood. And it's going to eliminate nitrogenous waste. This is our liquid waste system. So it's dealing a lot with, body liquid balances, especially electrolytes and water. The digestive system is going to work to break down food material. This is our physical and chemical breakdown process. The absorption of nutrients that we need and the elimination of indigestible bits. So this will be using our solid waste disposal system as opposed to the urinary, which is our liquid waste. But here we're going to pick up the nutrients and anything that's absorbable from the food that we intake. And finally, the reproductive system. This is the overall function of the reproductive system is to produce offspring. So we're going to produce sex cells, deliver sex cells, and house the development of embryo, fetus, and into infant. And there's a lot going on in this system. But again, kind of the general function of the reproductive system is to produce viable offspring. So here we start thinking about what the highly organized human body is actually going to do. So we have a number of necessary life functions, right? And it's going to be how we maintain life as a human. So we've got a number of necessary life functions. First here, survival instinct and maintaining boundaries. So the maintenance of boundaries is that what's inside stays inside and what's outside stays outside, right? So if it's in, it stays in, and if it's out, it stays out. For example, the integumentary system is a place where this plays a big role, along with any of your plasma or cellular membrane. Movement, this is about the changing of body position. So it could be the actual physical movement of the human body, where we're manipulating the external environment, or it could be internal movement or cellular movement. So both internal and external movement, right? So how the body changes position, how we move blood, the process of digestion, those all fall in movement. Our responsiveness is how you sense, monitor, and react to both internal and external stimuli. So your physical response as well as your body's internal response. Those both fall here. Digestion, which we just talked about, that's the breaking down of complex food into simpler. And then working with the blood for delivery, which you'll talk about in Bio 202. Metabolism is relating to any chemical process that manufactures substances to support life. So it's any chemical process in the human body. And we talk about some different pieces here with metabolism and anabolism, but generally speaking, metabolism is about being in the state of change, and then just all chemical reactions that happen with body cells. Excretion we kind of talked about already. It's the removal of waste from both metabolic processes, but also from the results of digestion. We use excretion both with urinary, such as urea and urine, but then also indigestible food residue in the form of feces. Reproduction we talked about as well, cellular replication, but also species survival. Right? So it happens at the cellular level and it happens at the organism level. It's regulated with hormones, which you'll talk about in Bio 202, and the production of, quote, more. So all the way from the cellular level all the way up to the organism level that we already just talked about. And then we've got growth and differentiation. So growth is an increase in size, right? Not necessarily shape, but it's increase in the cell number or the cell size. But then differentiation has to do with how specialized tissues form from unspecialized cells through a change process. So ultimately, the body systems are working to maintain life. But life is fragile and there are some survival needs, which you can see listed here, that are going to help keep the body working and functioning within our homeostatic boundaries. And really just them being present is enough. They have to be present in the proper amount. Too much or too little could be harmful. So for example, right, nutrients, right? So we take those in via the diet. There's substances used for energy and cell building, right? We've got some that are plant-based, carbohydrates, vitamins, minerals. We have some that are animal-based, proteins and fats. Carbohydrates, your major energy for body cells, right? Vitamins for chemical reactions, fats, which are essential for building cell structures. Those are all different nutrients that we do need to take in. Oxygen, well, it doesn't matter how many nutrients you take in if you don't have oxygen. So chemical reactions that release energy from foods are oxidative, meaning they require oxygen. Water is the single most abundant chemical substance in the body. We talk about it, right? More than 60% of our body weight is water. It's constantly moving in and out of our bodies, in and out of our cells, and everything and everywhere it goes. So that is the single most abundant chemical substance in the body. Remember, proper amounts of everything are needed, including water. Appropriate normal body temperature, right, is our 98.6. We go below that, you get slower metabolic reactions. They can keep getting slower until they stop. That would be bad. If you get too high above the 98.6, you get chemical reactions that are frantic and they also stop functioning. So we have a range. You're seeing a lot of this, especially now as they talk about COVID and fevers above 100.4. So they give that normal 98.6, but you get this 2-degree buffer that says, yeah, you're still okay. So you see a lot more of taking temperature going on and how that impacts kind of normal need for life. And then finally, atmospheric pressure has to do with the force that air exerts on the surface of the body. We're dealing with both internal and external pressures. So breathing and gas exchange depend on atomic pressure. For example, if you go up to high altitude, things change. Sometimes it's harder for other people to feel like they can catch their breath. So the body works within a range of atmospheric pressure. So all these things in proper balance amount to the ability to survive. Otherwise, you see things like nutritional disease and obesity. And really, while these ones are listed, they're not everything. We could live without gravity, but the quality of life may go down, right? So it's taking everything into a little bit of perspective. So homeostasis is really a dynamic state of equilibrium or balance, right? It's the ability to maintain constant internal environment regardless of what's going on in the external environment. And the ability to vary within some narrow limits. This dynamic or unchanging literal translation is primarily by the nervous and endocrine systems working together to keep a small margin for error. And we're going to look at how the body works to control these mechanisms in a couple different ways that it does that through negative and positive feedback. So control within the body is essential for homeostasis, and it does this by communicating. So communication is mostly nervous and endocrine systems and a whole ton of electrical impulses or potentially blood-borne hormones, which can be information carriers. So we have a variable that's going to cause this mechanism to operate, right? So it's a factor or event being regulated. And all mechanisms are processing involving at least 3 components that are working together, and these 3 components that work together are listed here. Right? We've got our sensor or our receptor, so it's going to monitor the environment, responding to stimuli, and sending information along afferent pathways to our second component, which is the control center. The control center is going to determine the set point, or the level that needs to be maintained. It's going to analyze what's being received and compare it to the set point and determine the response. That information is going to flow from the control center along efferent pathways to our final component known as the effector. The effector's job is to carry out the response. The result of the response then feeds back to influence the effect of the stimulus, either reducing it so the whole process is shut off or enhancing it so the process continues at an even faster rate. The difference between those 2 effects, or output, is going to indicate the difference between negative versus positive feedback. So again, the output here, the effector carries out the control center's response, is either going to be part of a negative feedback mechanism or a positive feedback mechanism. Most of the homeostatic control mechanisms are negative feedback mechanisms. Here, the output is going to shut off the original effect of the stimulus before reducing its intensity. Right? So it changes or causes the variable to change in a direction opposite of the initial change, so it gets back to its ideal status, right? So it's going to shut off or reduce the intensity. It's going to maintain the constancy of the internal environment. Remember, opposite is the key here. So negative is going to shut off the original stimulus, reducing its intensity in the opposite. This is fine control, and some good examples here would be the thermostat in your house. Right? So you have a set point, and right now, for most of us here, we're running our air conditioning. Air at, let's say we'll pick a number, 80 degrees. When the temperature inside your home rises above that 80 degrees, the air conditioning will kick on. The air conditioning will run until set point is reached, at which time then it turns off the original stimulus. Right, so we have that with your body thermostat and balance with muscles that contract and relax to just hold your posture. The hormonal control of your blood sugar, those are all negative feedback mechanisms. On the other hand, our positive feedback mechanisms are where the initial response enhances the original stimulus, so further responses are greater. The feedback mechanism is positive because the result proceeds in the same direction as it was already headed. This is much more rare in the body than negative feedback. Again, we're talking about enhancing the original stimulus, and it's typically set off like a linked sequence of events. So things like the enhancement of labor during pregnancy, the process of blood clotting, those would be positive feedback. It's a little less in the terms of fine control, and again, you're talking about kind of layering and enhancing stimuli. And then just kind of a note is any damage or disturbance to the mechanism, either one, positive or negative, is considered a homeostatic imbalance. Therefore, the organs are less efficient, less stable, and you've got this increased risk of illness. Okay? So again, any damage, whether it's to the negative or the positive feedback mechanism, is kind of considered a major disturbance and increases risk for illness. In the final part of our first lecture here on the orientation of the human body, we have to be able to describe body parts and position accurately. So we've got to have some sort of initial reference point. And so our anatomical reference point is our standard body position, known as anatomical position or anatomical neutral. It really kind of resembles standing at attention, except for the palms forward piece. So here we have 4 primary criteria. You are standing erect, right? Feet are parallel, arms are at your side, and palms face forward. And I've included a picture so that you can see what that looks like. So now that we have kind of a reference point, we can now use our directional terms to explain where one body structure is in relation to the other. So in your textbook, in Table 1.1, and there's a list in the Lecture 1 document, so the notes template, that kind of lists some commonly used orientation and directional terms. You can see a lot of information in the book about that. But, basically you're talking about things that are, for example, complementary statements, so superior versus inferior, so superior being toward the head, inferior being toward the feet. You need to be able to use these terms to describe what you're looking at on the body. So I would encourage you to pick 2 points and use the directional terms to describe where one is in relation to the other, right? So it gives you some examples right in that Table 1.1 in your book, but see if you can think of some others just for practice. So in addition to now being able to kind of describe our body parts in relation to one another, with anatomical studies, typically the body gets sectioned, so along a flat surface called a plane. The most frequently used body planes are these 3 listed here: frontal, sagittal, and transverse, and they lie at right angles to one another. So the section is named for the plane along which it is cut. So a cut along a sagittal plane produces a sagittal section. Sagittal plane is the vertical plane, right? It's going to divide the body into right and left parts. The sagittal plane that is exactly at the midline is known as mid-sagittal or median plane. Sometimes people refer to any other besides the mid-sagittal plane. Offset from the middle are parasagittal, but as long as you know that the sagittal plane divides the body into right and left parts that do not have to be equal. Your frontal plane divides the body into anterior and posterior parts. The frontal plane could also be called a coronal plane, but it's cutting from left to right, creating a front and a back, so an anterior and a posterior. And then your transverse plane lies on a horizontal plane, and it's going to run from right to left, dividing the body into superior top, inferior bottom parts. Many different transverse planes exist in every possible level, so a transverse section may also be called a cross section, so just kind of keeping that in mind. So those are the 3 most commonly used planes. Frontal, creating a front and a back, right? So anterior, posterior. Sagittal plane, creating a right and a left. And a transverse plane, creating top and bottom. And finally in this lecture, I like to cover the abdominopelvic quadrant, solely because it gives you an understanding of what's where, and when somebody puts their hand on, quote, their stomach, you can actually kind of get a sense of what they're actually putting their hand on. So the abdominopelvic cavity is rather large, containing lots of organs, as you can see on this picture, so it helps divide into smaller areas for study. So you're finding left upper, left lower, right lower quadrants. And so really it's just kind of 4 cuts at right angles, dividing it into 4 quadrants on 2 planes, kind of like tic-tac-toe a little bit, but a little bit smaller. And sometimes people divide this even further into 9 abdominopelvic regions. So one of the things I just like to point out is your stomach's up way higher than people think it is. And that your appendix is in that lower right quadrant, but sometimes you get what's called referred pain on the left side. So just a quick look, nothing serious here, a quick look of what organs lie in what quadrant. So together we have survived week 1, lecture 1, yay. We'll have some different things to look at for first lab, and there's a separate PowerPoint posted. And just a quick reminder to make sure that you carefully check Canvas for due dates. You have 2 quizzes, quiz on introduction and directional terms, 2 separate quizzes. You have your syllabus receipt via Google form that you need to complete. And then you'll be uploading pictures of the language of anatomy out of your lab manual to Canvas as well. And I'm finalizing, making sure everything actually works. So if you have any problems, don't hesitate to email me directly using your PVCC email. This is it. Week 1 done.